Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a grand battle or a powerful king, but with something even more chaotic, intricate, and tangled than court politics. Love in the Middle Ages. Believe it or not, falling in love during a time when your parents controlled everything, from the harvest to your heart, was harder than sending an "I love you" text without being left on read. Back then, there was no fall in love and then marry. It was marry first, love, if you're lucky. And that wedding, it wasn't the culmination of a first glance or a sweet laugh. It was about land, about cattle, about families needing alliances. It was a deal, contract, a property transfer signed in ink, blood, and a fertile goat. Love, in the eyes of parents at the time, was a soft, frivolous thing, not worth exchanging for a few acres. So, before you get too emotional, hit like if you believe in love, or if you've ever been ignored by a crush just because you didn't have 20 acres and a not too smelly pigsty. And remember to leave a comment. Where are you listening from, and what time is it now? I always enjoy imagining a world where nightlights twinkle and hearts still dream of fairy tale love, despite the electric bills. Now, dim the lights, set the fan to low, pour a cup of tea or wine if you fancy living like a weary count, and take a deep breath. Let's journey back to a time when daring to love someone from a different class meant the best blessing you could hope for was, may you not be exiled to a land full of rocks and devoid of bakeries. You're standing in a small village where the church bell mingles with the morning rooster's crow. Your hands tremble, holding a hastily written letter on goatskin, the ink still wet. Your heart pounds, not from romance, but from fear. Fear that if someone finds out, you'll not only be forbidden from seeing them, but also be beaten, have your head shaved, or be sent to a monastery to live in silence for the rest of your life, and that's if you're lucky. Your love isn't wrong. It's just untimely. You're a blacksmith, soot-covered from coal, your hands calloused from hammer and iron. She's the daughter of a lord, raised with books, harps, and dresses worth your entire harvest. A single glance could be a death sentence. A whisper could be deemed treason against the social order. You can't just chat for fun. Every glance is a gamble. Every letter challenges divine authority. You're not just in love, you're committing rebellion. And yet, you write, you look, you wait, because a moment together, even in the shadows of an abandoned church, is worth more than a lifetime of arranged living. It's not that medieval people didn't dream. On the contrary, they dreamed even more intensely, because they had no choice. No Tinder, no story likes, no chance meetings in a bookstore cafe. Ever thought you loved the wrong person? Try imagining love in the Middle Ages, where loving someone society forbids you to even think about is taboo, simply because they were born on the other side of the castle wall. In medieval society, love wasn't a choice. It was an act of rebellion. The strict class divisions meant that being born into the wrong status rendered your feelings illegal. Loving the wrong person didn't just bring shame. It could tarnish your family's reputation, cost them trade opportunities, even lead to punishment. Harsh, but that's reality. When marriage is a political and financial tool, personal feelings are considered a luxury. Imagine, you're born a baker, and the one you fancy is the son of a wealthy merchant. A little extra sugar in a cake when he visits your shop could spark gossip. If you're a farmer's daughter who falls for a knight, you might have to marry a cobbler immediately to avoid scandal. Everything was controlled, from glances to the path home. And us, modern folks, we can send heart emojis, openly share love stories, even break up via text. We have the freedom to love, to choose, to err, and to start over. A privilege that people of the past, no matter how romantic, could only dream of. So, if you're in love with someone your parents don't object to, and you don't need to trade 2 cows for a date, you're living a dream people 1,000 years ago longed for. Modern love can be chaotic, complicated, sometimes maddening. But at least it's ours, not society's, not the family's, and not something exchanged for a riverside wheat field. In medieval marriage, women had no voice, they were entirely passive. The decision rested firmly in the hands of fathers, brothers, or any gentleman holding the family ledger. And the girl, she was just part of the plan, like a chess piece on the board, never making her own moves. Now, suppose you're not a farmer worrying about crops, or a gentleman calculating land deals. Suppose you're a medieval maiden, wearing a long dress, hair neatly braided, and never having made a significant decision in your life. What would your love life be like? Welcome to the strange world of arranged marriages. But wait, don't be mistaken. This isn't about love. It's political diplomacy. A wedding is a survival treaty, sometimes a form of hostage exchange, sometimes a reward after a battle. You, a gentle noblewoman, will be married off to someone your father deems suitable. And if you dare refuse, you're labeled a stubborn daughter in the family. Not everyone faced this, but don't get your hopes up. You might daydream while embroidering or sneak glances at the wandering minstrel, but never let anyone know. You're taught to be silent, obedient, and grateful because you've been chosen. Sometimes people ask, didn't noblewomen live comfortably? Then look at Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the few women who dared to break the rules. She married King Louis VII of France, then, surprise, divorced him and married King Henry II of England. A shocking twist that shook 12th century Europe. But remember, Eleanor was an exception. Precisely because she was rare, she became legendary. And common women, they had a bit more freedom, like seeing their future husband's face before the wedding. They might agree to marry, maybe not, but love was still governed by land, money, or simply the need to survive in a harsh society. Today, you can love or not, initiate dates, break up, block messages. But back then, saying no was serious. It could get you locked in a monastery or forced into marriage to silence rumors. Personal freedom? That concept didn't even exist then. In the best-case scenario, you hoped to marry someone not too terrible, and pray he didn't die early on the battlefield. Hoping for more was perhaps a luxury. Loving someone? Wonderful. But you had to accept. Your feelings had no bearing on marriage decisions. Welcome to medieval life. Arranged, smiling, and hopeful. If lucky, your husband would have a modest beard and not snore too loudly. If not, you'd still live your whole life as someone's wife, without ever having an audition. The truth has always been harsh. Most women of that era only wished for the right to choose. To freely say, I want to, not I must. So next time you swipe left on someone on a dating app, remember, you're enjoying a historical privilege that countless women before you never even dreamed of. You wonder what the ideal age for marriage was in the Middle Ages. Not 20, not even 18, but 12. Yes, you heard that right. For the nobility, marrying off boys and girls at ages 12 to 14 wasn't just legal. It was considered reasonable. Because in the eyes of society, you weren't a child. You were part of a political strategy. Let's say you're a noble boy who just turned 13. You're still trying to ride a horse properly and can't tell the difference between apple cider and apple juice. But your parents have already picked out your bride. A 12-year-old girl you've never met, except for a portrait that looks suspiciously like a bowl of porridge. Marriage? It wasn't the result of love but a contract. An agreement between two families. Children, barely cutting wisdom teeth, became living cards in a political game. Love wasn't expected. Friendship? Maybe later. For now, it was about honor and bloodlines. The earlier the marriage, the lower the risk of unplanned incidents. Of course, they didn't always live together right after the wedding. Not immediately, at least. Sometimes the marriage was a deposit. The ceremony would happen, but the couple wouldn't live together for a few more years. But that didn't change the fact. You were husband and wife on paper, by vow before God. Even before you knew what your favorite hobby was, aside from flute playing. And if you think age was a concern, back then it was quite the opposite. One person 12, the other 30, totally normal. In fact, it was seen as lucky if the older party had money, land, and wasn't too sickly. Who cared about emotional compatibility when the goal was heirs and merged estates? Affection, seen as a bonus if it happened. If not, oh well. Your job was to fulfill the marriage pact, bear children on schedule, and smile in the right places. A wedding wasn't a celebration of two people. It was a signing ceremony. A contract sealed with wedding flowers and the awkward smiles of two kids who still had baby teeth. Of course, there were exceptions. Some couples genuinely loved each other, but they were as rare as a love letter not intercepted by a monk. Most of the time, you married because someone else decided you should. And if you disagreed, most likely, you'd be shipped off to a convent or labeled the burden that no one will marry. So the next time you complain about a bad date from an app, remember, at least you didn't have to wear a wedding dress right after learning your multiplication tables. And at least you have the right to say no, to wait, to love when you're ready, not when your family decides you're old enough to be a political tool. Welcome to the medieval wedding, where love bloomed under the gaze of the entire community and 2 goatskin drums. It was one of the rare occasions when you didn't just have to worry about plowing fields, reciting prayers, or pretending not to blush at the innkeeper's daughter's gaze. Today, you were getting married. Sort of, as long as it followed protocol, had all the rituals, and included your family, a priest, and 3 geese. Weddings were often held in churches, solemn, echoing with scripture, lit by colored stained glass. But don't think it stopped there. After the sacred rites came nights of endless feasting. There was music, wine, and relatives dancing like tomorrow didn't exist. You'd never seen so many people laughing, though some had clearly had one too many. A wedding feast wasn't just about food, it was a communal performance. There were singing contests between families, with the groom forced to write rhyming verses praising his mother-in-law. There was cake throwing, not gentle tossing, but real throwing. Catch it and you'd be lucky all year. And of course, the bizarre games. Blindfolded find the bride among ants, or pig racing for honored guests bold enough and humble enough to try. If you were the bride, you were basically wearing a castle. The dress wasn't just heavy. It was studded with gems, lined with silk, and hand-embroidered. Enough to keep you rooted in place through the whole ceremony. Jewelry sparkled so brightly the priest had to squint. But that was the easy part. The wedding night? Now we enter strange territory. In some places, they demanded proof of virginity, yes, actual proof before an audience. Some even had a witness ritual, or at least an inspection of the bed sheets the next morning. Romantic? Not quite. Creepy? Absolutely. But it underscored a truth. A wedding was a public event, not a private affair. What you signed wasn't just a vow to your partner. It was a covenant with the entire village, your family, and God. Everyone participated, watched, and commented. A wedding marked your place in society, and your family's ability to throw a proper party. Of course, real love could still be found there. Maybe in a shy glance during the 3rd song and 5th cup of wine. Maybe in a gentle hand squeeze when no one was looking. But most of the time, the wedding was a performance, and you were the lead in your family's drama. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by modern wedding planning, don't forget that at least you don't have to wear a 20-kilo dress. No one's inspecting your sheets, and the town's chattiest priest isn't your guest of honor. You get to choose, decide, and maybe even skip the 3 geese. That's the privilege of the 21st century. It wasn't a candlelit confession or a swipe left, swipe right message. This was the art of medieval flirting, a world where feelings were conveyed through glances, gestures, and cryptic poetry. A world where sending a message meant slipping a letter into someone's sleeve and pretending to drop it. If you were in love, you had to prepare for a process longer than winter and more delicate than brewing mulled wine. No phones, no apps. Communication started with the eyes. A stolen glance at a feast, a fleeting look in church, a twitch of the handkerchief, a bowed head, a bitten lip. Each could carry 1,000 meanings. But it had to be subtle. A look held too long, improper. A smile too wide, rumors would bubble up like beer foam at a village fair. So what did people do? Poetry, music, a handwritten verse, a sorrowful lute melody in the square. You didn't say, "I like you." You said, "My heart is a bird seeking its nest in your eyes." And if you couldn't write poetry, hire a troubadour. And if you were the troubadour, good luck, because you'd have to pretend the poem was spontaneous and definitely not for the blushing lady in the front row. Love letters were an art form. You couldn't hand them over directly, you had to hide them. In a religious book, under a pillow, beside the windowsill, or, if you were bold, inside the fireplace and pray they retrieved it before your sonnet became ash. Those tiny scraps, penned with homemade ink and nervous hearts, were emotional treasure troves. But remember, don't sign your name. You want to impress, not be summoned to confession. Flirting then was a long play theater. There were no crush today, coffee tomorrow moments. Sometimes it took months just to get them to look at you for more than 3 seconds. Sometimes you had to accidentally walk past their house, daily. And when they finally responded, a fleeting smile, a ribbon forgotten on a bench, it felt like a greater triumph than winning a joust. Of course, some went too far. A ridiculous gesture, a glance at the wrong moment, and you were branded a disgraceful flirt, which was practically a death sentence for your noble love life. So you learned to be gentle, discreet, respectful, a form of love full of restraint, yet bursting with yearning. And if you think all this sounds overly elaborate, just remember that in a world without emojis, one well-timed look was a poem. One gesture to the right person was a love song. Flirting without technology wasn't easier, but it was definitely far more romantic. It wasn't a bar date under purple lights with a DJ spinning remixes. This was the medieval fair, where love fermented under the sounds of folk instruments, floor-length dresses, and laughter echoing around the honey cake stall. If you were of marrying age and still hadn't found someone to split a roasted sausage with, the fair was where you needed to be. Welcome to the orchestral version of Tinder, where you didn't swipe, you just danced the right steps. The fair wasn't just a market. It was an emotional playground. There was music, from lutes to hand drums. There was dancing, from two-hand twirls to that walk-around-the-chair move that really meant 4 harvests worth of side-eye. Puffy skirts, oversized bows, bursting vests. Everyone dressed like they were ready to marry on the spot. And sometimes they did. Folk games weren't just for fun, they were social tools. You might try your hand at ring toss, cake baking, or sack racing. Nothing says "notice me" like falling into a hay pile and laughing out loud. These games were how society sent flirt signals without breaking rules. Play together, laugh together, sneak glances together. Some encounters started with a dance and ended in marriage. Some glances were fleeting, but enough to rob you of sleep all autumn long. And if you think everyone danced just for fun, think again. A single twirl could be a promise. A well-timed spin could replace an entire love poem. The vibe of the fair was a little like a bar today, except instead of cocktails, you had home-brewed ale. Instead of a DJ, a wandering bard who knew 5 chords and 12 songs about the moon. But the essence was the same. Eye contact, music, the chance to meet someone, and the very real possibility of doing something slightly foolish under the moonlight. Of course, not everyone found love. Sometimes you just went home with a prize turnip and muddy shoes. But sometimes, between a silly singing contest and an off-key trumpet, you caught a look that made your heart beat like a festival drum. And even if it was fleeting, that feeling could warm an entire winter. Because in the end, medieval love, like the fair, wasn't always about achieving something concrete. It was about truly living among others. A rare chance for the heart to flutter and for footsteps to find someone moving to the same rhythm. No apps, no messages, just music, ale, and a quiet hope in every spin on the dusty ground. But those were rare moments, occasions where the heart was allowed to speak between music and candlelight. Most of the time, love had to survive in the shadows, beneath the cloak of taboo, and always under threat from the unforgiving rules of society. Think sneaking around behind your parents' backs was a high school thing? In the Middle Ages, it could get you shaved bald, thrown into a convent, or quietly sent away for reasons too delicate to explain. Dating wasn't in the family manual. Spontaneous love, or worse, romantic love, was enough to make noble parents' hair stand on end. Every decision had to pass through father, mother, the elder cousin, and the local priest, because in most cases, personal affection was seen as a threat, a disruption of order, a scandal waiting to happen, and usually an obstacle to marrying you off for 3 acres and a military alliance. So every move was monitored. Your gaze, your words, even your laughter. There was always a third party, wet nurse, chaperone, priest, or gatekeeper with fox-like hearing. Get caught? The punishment wasn't just grounded, it was social exile. banishment to a distant manor, a rushed marriage, or worse, monastic confinement under the label of penitence. Love had to be as quiet as a breeze.
No noise, no trace.
And if it left an echo, pray it was faint enough not to be discussed at Sunday service. The most heartbreaking part, even if you got past the watchful eyes, most couples still didn't end up together. Because of poverty, religious differences, class walls, and the fear of gossip. Love in that era was like firelight, warm, beautiful, but one gust of prejudice, and it vanished. A classic example, Tristan and Isolde. A knight brave, loyal, and tragically in love with the one heart he was forbidden to touch. The queens. Isolde, beautiful, intelligent, and unlucky, was forced into a political marriage, but her heart belonged elsewhere. They met in shadows, exchanged glances during cold feasts, whispered beside hearth fires. They lived in stolen moments from a world that gave them none. No one cheered, no one forgave. They loved like walking a tightrope between moral walls and royal duty. And then, like every gut-wrenching tragedy, they couldn't escape. One died, the other followed.
No trumpets.
No songs, just a lullaby of sorrow. Secret meetings, inner torment, and a final parting. Not because they didn't love, but because the world wouldn't let them. They became symbols, not of fulfilled love, but of love that was never allowed to live. Thus, in the grand chronicle of medieval courtship, most romances ended in silence.
No wedding, no poem.
Just a name in someone's memory and a whispered, if only, after they'd married someone else. But not all medieval love stories ended quietly. In distant villages, where crops mattered more than rituals, and hearts were simpler than the laws, some loves bloomed among dirt, sweat, and exchanged glances over damp firewood. Peasant love lacked chandeliers and harp melodies, but could stir the heart no less than Romeo and Juliet. You woke up with the cows, slept beside the chickens, and spent most days ankle-deep in mud. You weren't searching for poetic soulmates. You just wanted someone who could milk a goat without causing drama. Welcome to peasant dating, where love was practical, gestures were simple, and compatibility meant surviving winter together. In your world, dating wasn't long conversations, it was shared chores. You noticed someone for being diligent, not whining, and having decent teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. Your family might not meddle too much, but you'd still hear whispers. Do they have land? Any cows? Love still had to be paved with property. How did you show affection? Through small, useful gifts. A basket of eggs, a bundle of firewood, or a perfect turnip. If you were bold, maybe a hand-woven ribbon or a finely carved spoon. Nothing said, "I'm serious," like a spoon whittled by candlelight while your pig judged you silently. Conversations happened during shared labor. Walking to the mill, chatting while herding sheep, or making small talk while shoveling something suspicious smelling. No poetry. You talked about weather, harvests, and whether old Thomas fell down the well again. And yet, in its own way, it was deeply romantic. There was sweetness in that simplicity. Life together wasn't built on ideals, but cooperation. You knew each other's strengths, flaws, and goat-escape response time. Proposals came quickly. If both sides agreed, and so did the families, you got married. Maybe you moved into an old hut. Maybe you built one with the village's help. You brought your best blanket. They brought a goat. Together, you began the strange miracle of surviving marriage. Not glamorous, but honest. You did it. You found someone who could cook, clean, tolerate your family, and wasn't terrified of your feet. They didn't write poetry, but they built walls. They didn't swear eternal love, but they lit the fire each morning. Not dazzling, but steady. Not grand, but enduring. And the strangest thing? They're barely in the history books. No epic was written about the peasant couple who lived quietly for 40 years with 6 kids and an old dog. But if there were, it would be a love song. Simple and beautiful. However, the truth is that romantic love in the Middle Ages was exceedingly rare. Because love back then wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a dangerous game, where emotions could lead to punishment, scandal, or worse, Think love is a private affair? Not at all. Your feelings could become the business of the entire village, the parish priest, the local authorities, and, unfortunately, even the court. Suppose you fell in love with someone of a different religion. That wasn't just about differing beliefs, it was an act that could be criminal. Interfaith marriage was banned by both church and law. If discovered, you wouldn't just be forced to break up, you could be exiled, stripped of all property, or branded a heretic. And remember, back then, sorry, I just fell for the wrong person, didn't count as a valid excuse. And if you were someone of status who fell for someone poor, sorry, that wasn't love, that was a scandal. Your family would react as if you were about to sell the ancestral home to buy onions. They didn't want Lady Falls for stable boy. They wanted dowries, political alliances, and a preserved family name. Feelings between servants, merchants, craftsmen, those of the lower classes, were often considered insignificant. No one wrote poems about them. No one recorded their love stories in chronicles. But they still loved, quietly, in fear, within the confines of social rank. They glanced at each other while carrying water, brushed hands while passing bread, and then they parted. Because if discovered, you might lose your job, be forced into another marriage, or sent far away. Sometimes the authorities even intervened, as if love were a criminal offense. And if it went further, an unapproved marriage, an illegitimate child, your entire life might be stamped with shame. And so, in the history of medieval romance, most non-conforming relationships ended in silence. No wedding.
No poetry.
Just a name in someone's memory and a whispered, if only, after they had become someone else's spouse. Because loving the wrong person at the wrong time was sometimes a tragedy too forbidden to be told. So don't be too quick to imagine medieval love as all poetry, moonlight, and love letters. That's an illusion. At least, not in the realities behind the oak doors of grand castles. Adultery back then wasn't a juicy subplot. It was a tightly kept secret, wrapped in veils, embroidery rooms, and prayers. If you were a noble lady and your husband was always away, for politics, for battle, or simply because he loved himself too much, who would whisper to you in those long, echoing hallways? Maybe a servant, maybe a newly arrived knight shirtless, glistening with sweat after sword practice. Such relationships didn't happen in rose gardens at noon, but in the margins of rituals. A handkerchief embroidered for him, a goblet poured too intentionally, a gaze that lingered a second too long during scripture reading. But if caught, there was no civil breakup, only execution, exile, or asset seizure. Not just honor, but the entire family legacy could collapse. Love triangles? Abundant, especially when two powerful houses arranged a match, but hearts strayed elsewhere. A young master in love with a maid, a lady bewitched by the enemy's son. Tensions soared like a church choir hitting the wrong chord. Still beautiful, but everyone sensed something was off. And it didn't always end like a fairy tale. Many three-way tales ended with no one happy. One marrying out of duty, another entering a convent, the third vanishing into a stormy night. Their stories survived in kitchen whispers, market murmurs, or tucked away in diaries hidden under pillows, if anyone dared write them at all. You could live with one person but love another. Wake in a lavish castle, yet find your soul trapped in a glance exchanged yesterday at the stables. Adultery wasn't just a moral failure. It was the hunger of a soul forced to live by rules it didn't write. And women, they often paid the highest price. Even if your husband strayed, the judgment fell on you, the one not gentle enough, who couldn't keep her man. They told you to pray more, speak less, and survive on the scraps left over from someone else's love banquet. Affairs have always happened, people have always loved in messy ways. But the difference between now and the Middle Ages? The consequences. Today, if you cheat, worst case, you break up, lose some followers, get trash-talked online, cry into a bucket of fried chicken with your best friend. You might be hurt, ashamed, caught in drama, but you get another chance. To start over, to love again, to move on. Back then, adultery wasn't just a scandal, it was a crime. You could be exiled, lose everything, be locked away in a convent for life, or be executed. Yes, loving the wrong person could literally cost you your life, not an exaggeration. Especially if you were a woman. A man's affair might be brushed off or forgiven. But a woman, one glance at the wrong moment, one ill-timed rumor, and you could be condemned. No solid proof needed, just someone who didn't like your face. Nowadays, love triangles are just spicy drama on streaming shows. But back then, they were catastrophic. No second chances.
No amicable breakup.
Just silence, suffering, or a tragic end no one wanted. And yet, people still loved, still dared, still exchanged glances, stitched secret symbols into linens, and prayed for a day when they wouldn't have to hide their own hearts. Because the human heart, whether wrapped in silk or burlap, remains stubbornly sweet. It doesn't care that you're engaged, that vows have been said, or contracts signed. It only knows that, in that hallway, someone is looking at you like the world has narrowed to just one person. So you sneak, you tremble, you brush hands over a prayer book. Not because it's perfect, but because you are alive, and you dare to love. In a world where love could cost you everything, just loving even once is already a brilliant victory. Even if, in the end, you have to pretend not to remember each other's names, or carve them secretly on the inside of a silver cup no one ever drinks from. Let's be clear. Today, loving the wrong person might get you into drama. Back then, could take your entire life. You think adultery in the Middle Ages was just the stuff of novels? Meet Blanche of Burgundy, a real queen, once cloaked in luxury, who died in darkness. Blanche wasn't a Cinderella story. She was a noblewoman, married off to Charles, the French prince and son of King Philip IV. A classic political marriage. No love, but plenty of duties, and more watchful eyes than candles in the palace. Charles was cold, the court was crowded, and Blanche, perhaps, just wanted something that felt alive. In 1314, scandal erupted. Blanche and her sister-in-law Margaret were accused of having affairs with two young Norman knights. Not caught by text messages, but by an embroidered pouch. The story goes that the knights were seen wearing tokens from the ladies, a sort of medieval matching bracelet, and the fire was lit. The knights were tortured, and as with all medieval stories involving torture, they confessed. Blanche and Margaret were sentenced to life imprisonment, locked away in Chateau Gallard, a fortress beautiful in its desolation, cold to the point of despair. And here's the bitterest part. Charles later became King Charles IV, but he never pardoned Blanche. His wife, the one who sat beside him at feasts, stood beside him at their wedding, heard the same hymns, was now just a forgotten name beneath stone. Blanche died in 1326, in prison, childless, titleless, alone. No one knows if the love was real. Maybe Blanche loved. Maybe she just wanted to be seen as a person, not a clause in a contract. But back then, loving the wrong person or merely being suspected of it was enough to have your life buried in cold stone. So when we speak of medieval, scandalous love stories, remember, they weren't just drama. They were life sentences, silent deaths, entire lives erased simply for daring to feel something real. You may have heard of Cleopatra, maybe even Queen Elizabeth I, but have you heard of the woman who defied the Roman Empire, declared herself Queen of the East, and nearly succeeded? Her name was Zenobia, and she didn't rule by fear or by permission. No, her court was pride, forged in desert sun, blazing across the sands of Palmyra. Her power didn't come from marriage, it came from intellect and an unbreakable will. She was Queen of Palmyra, a wealthy, strategic oasis in the heart of the Syrian desert, where caravans from east and west knelt in deference. Imagine golden stone walls, Greco-style arches, camels draped in silk and incense, and at the center, a woman in a purple cloak, head held high like she was speaking to the stars. Zenobia didn't inherit a crown like jewelry. She claimed it, with scholarship, with strategy, with something many empires lacked, vision. Her people, Syriac, Arab, Greek, followed not out of fear but belief. Even among warriors and rebels, she stood tall. She was queen, scholar, and commander. No emperor taught her to rule. No general fought in her place. To be clear, much of what we know comes from Roman historians. not known for their kindness to powerful women. But if even a fraction is true, Zenobia wasn't just a widowed queen. She was a living dynasty. Here's the core of the story. Rome in the 3rd century was cracking. The Eastern Empire was fragile. And Zenobia saw what few dared to say, opportunity. She declared independence, called herself Empress of the East, seized Egypt, marched into Anatolia, expanded faster than any emperor before. One woman ruling the Middle East. She didn't ask permission. She advanced. Emperor Aurelian, newly crowned, young, ambitious, couldn't tolerate it. Not because he needed Palmyra, but because he couldn't let a woman prove Rome wasn't untouchable. He marched east. War began. Zenobia didn't back down. She organized defenses, raised armies, negotiated with Persia, wrote in Greek and Aramaic to rally support. She didn't cry, didn't hide, didn't beg, but Palmyra was besieged. Roman troops closed in. The palace trembled. Zenobia, with the full majesty of a dynasty, mounted her camel, crossed the Euphrates, seeking aid from Persia. She was captured not on the battlefield, but on the road to one last hope. Roman records say she was paraded in golden chains through Rome, a trophy. But she didn't bow, didn't weep. In her faded purple robe, the color of royalty, she looked at the crowd as if judging Rome itself. No one knows how her story ended. Some say she was poisoned. Others say she lived out her days in Italy as a philosopher in a villa. But the truth is this. She had written her name on the map with defiance and will. And that was only the beginning of her legend. The city of Palmyra, proud, radiant, turned to ash. Rome endured, but now had to remember that once. A woman from the desert made the empire shudder. Zenobia didn't write memoirs, didn't carve her face on coins. She simply stood quiet beside the ruins of her kingdom. The rebellion had ended, but her spirit, still unbroken, still standing tall. Turns out, rebellion doesn't grant freedom overnight. But Palmyra won more than just territory. They rattled the very order of the empire. Zenobia's defiance of Rome sent shockwaves through the ancient world. From Egypt to Anatolia, and to the farthest edges of the empire, people whispered. An Eastern queen who dared lift her chin and stand against Rome, and nearly won. Not with a northern horde, but with a woman not born of royal blood, not touched by divine right, armed only with intellect, ambition, and a vision sharp as a blade. And yet, Zenobia didn't use her early victories to become a conqueror. She didn't march on Rome. She didn't claim Caesar's crown. She returned to Palmyra with the same clarity that had lifted her to power.
No excessive taxation, no senseless conquest.
She didn't want to rule Rome. She just wanted the East to no longer bow. Justice had been served. A new age of independence had dawned. And the empire would never again forget the name Palmyra. Because some enemies you simply cannot afford to underestimate. What makes this story extraordinary is that she stopped when she could have clung to more. Many, with power in hand, would grip it tighter. But Zenobia was different. She wanted Palmyra to be strong, not grand at any cost. And from there, her figure faded into history. No detailed records, no grand monuments, no gilded mausoleum in the desert. She vanished, like sand swept across the fallen columns of Palmyra. Roman historians debated. Was she really as dangerous as they claimed? Some said she was just a political puppet, that the title Queen of the East was exaggerated. But even the skeptics agreed. Someone made Rome tremble. And it wasn't an emperor. It wasn't a general. It was a mother, a scholar, a woman who believed knowledge could be a weapon. And her story, it doesn't need to be carved in stone. It was written in silk and carried by the desert wind. Because when the breeze moves through the crumbling arches of Palmyra, they say it still whispers her name. To understand Zenobia, you must understand Palmyra. A city not built for thrones of gold, but for convergence, for silk, gold, wisdom, and belief.
No Pantheon.
No blood-soaked arena. No library of Alexandria. Just markets where merchants spoke in many tongues. Academies where classes were held in both Greek and Syriac. warriors who could both ride camels and quote philosophers. Children there spoke 3 languages before they could write their names. Politics wasn't just about power, it was the art of survival between empires. Palmyrene soldiers wore leather armor, rode camels, and fought as if defending every brick of their homeland. And women, they weren't behind men. They stood beside them. Zenobia didn't shock because she wielded a sword. She shocked because everyone accepted that she could naturally. She didn't disguise herself, didn't chant slogans of women's rights. She simply acted better than anyone and never asked for permission. Palmyrene culture revered knowledge, but also honor. Injustice had a cost. Gold was wealth, but reputation was the strongest currency. Kings and queens needed council approval to rule. Leadership wasn't inherited, it was earned. When Zenobia wrote to Emperor Aurelian, she didn't plead for peace, nor show fear. She wrote in classical Greek, clear, composed. She signed Regina Orientis, Queen of the East.
No embellishment, no flattery.
Just a declaration that didn't need to be shouted. In essence, Zenobia wasn't an anomaly. She was the purest embodiment of Palmyra. Independent, learned, and dignified. She didn't rise despite being a woman. She rose because she was exactly who Palmyra needed, at the right time in the right place. While Rome had laws, Palmyra had a soul. And in that brutal showdown that shaped the fate of the East, that soul held its head high until the final breath. Because if you come from a city built of red sandstone, under a scorching sky, where wind and dust never rest, then kneeling was never an option. You know what's strange? Everything we know about Zenobia, her rebellion against Rome, the expansion of her empire to Egypt, and her dramatic fall, comes from ancient sources like the Historia Augusta and Roman historians. Sounds credible, right? Except these sources are also where many legends and melodramas were born. The Romans loved a good story, and if that story involved a proud queen, a bloody war, or betrayal of the empire, all the better. So how much of Zenobia's tale is true? That depends on how much you trust Roman writers, many of whom never even set foot in Palmyra, and wrote decades after the events, relying on secondhand reports, travelers' gossip, and whatever rumors were making the rounds across the empire. To them, history wasn't just documentation. It was theater. And yet, what's remarkable is that they chose to tell her story at all. In a world full of emperors, tyrants, and kings, the Roman historians paused to take note of an Eastern queen who dared challenge one of the greatest empires in history. That's no small thing. But let's zoom out. Why did the story spread so widely? Simple. It had everything. A noblewoman, a daring rebellion, a mighty foe, a battle to the death, and a tragic ending worthy of any Greek drama. If you were in Rome or Alexandria and heard this tale from a traveling bard, you would remember Zenobia. Not because she wore a crown, but because she dared to stand up to a superpower and almost won. And over time, her story evolved. Medieval chronicles painted her as a wild Amazon warrior. Renaissance artists portrayed her in golden chains, paraded through Roman streets like a trophy. She became a strange, fearsome, iconic figure. Yet through all the retellings, something clings to her legend. It may not be the exact dialogue or even the conquests, but the core of the story. A queen, a rebellion, a war, a downfall feels too human, too precise to be pure fiction. In the end, historians didn't just preserve Zenobia, they mythologized her. And while that might blur the line between fact and fiction, it also ensured that her name would outlive many of Aurelian's imperial decrees. Because history may forget generals, but it remembers the women who dared defy empires. For a queen with no surviving monument, Zenobia has haunted the imagination of empires for over 2,000 years. Renaissance painters adored her. She was the dramatic muse, perfect for a blood-soaked climax on canvas. In artwork, she's painted with defiant beauty, shackled yet regal. Subtle? No. Memorable? Absolutely. To European artists, Zenobia wasn't just a historical figure. She was symbolism, a woman punishing arrogance, a wild aristocrat, a cautionary tale, a feminist icon, depending on who held the brush. She could represent the righteous wrath of a ruler, the barbarism of the East, or the wisdom of a woman who refused to bow. Writers loved her too. In the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical treatises. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether she proved women could rule wisely, or whether she was a warning of what happens when emotion governs power. Either way, she was printed, and the strangest part, her own people left no record. The Palmarines faded from history, absorbed or erased by the cultures that followed.
No engravings.
No burial mound bearing a golden plaque that reads, "Zenobia was here." Her memory survives entirely through outsider eyes. And yet, she persists. In modern times, Zenobia has been reclaimed as a symbol of resistance against imperialism. Statues of her have risen in Syria. Scholars reevaluate her not as a rebel but as a legitimate head of state, a woman who governed, led armies, and negotiated from a position of strength. She's appeared in everything from documentaries to video games. In one moment, she's a playable leader in a strategy sim. In the next, she's the subject of academic journals on gender and power. That's range. And the oddest thing? We still don't know what she looked like.
No coin. No bust. No carving.
But we do know what she stood for. Strength, defiance, autonomy, and legacy. In a world that often forgets obedient queens, Zenobia is remembered precisely because she wasn't. She didn't wait for permission to enter history's gallery. She shattered the Roman stone wall, stood tall in the desert, and posed for one of the most defiant portraits ever drawn. Zenobia wasn't the first woman to build an empire by the sword, and she certainly wasn't the last. But history tends to treat women like her as exceptions, brief flares of power in a man's world. The truth is, Zenobia belonged to a long, often overlooked lineage, queens who ruled not with etiquette, but with strategy and unshakable resolve. Rewind a little. Before Zenobia, there was Shemuramat, the Assyrian queen believed to have inspired the legend of Semiramis, who built cities and crushed revolts. Around the same time, the Scythians, cultural cousins of Palmyra, buried their warrior women with weapons, their bones still bearing the scars of battle. These weren't rituals. They fought, bled, and died on horseback. And after Zenobia came others. Boudica, the Celtic queen who ignited a rebellion that burned Roman fortresses to ash in the 1st century. Like Zenobia, Boudica's war began in personal agony. Her daughters violated, her lands stolen. Her response? Fire. The parallels are uncanny. Loss, uprising, and an empire too arrogant to see the storm coming. Then there was Tamaris, queen of the steppes, who confronted Cyrus the Great. What binds these women, Zenobia among them, isn't just power. It's audacity. They led in ages that pretended women belonged only behind thrones. They weren't ornaments or proxies. They were strategists, generals, deciders of fate. And while male rulers were praised for conquest, these queens were called dangerous, unruly, barbaric. Why? Because they won. Zenobia was no anomaly. She was part of a broad, ancient pattern of women who rose when the world broke and made empires kneel. Her story, recorded by Roman historians and embroidered by the imagination of generations, reminds us, women ruling was not rare. It just wasn't often written down. So when you picture the Roman world, don't see only gladiators and togas. See a queen atop a camel in the desert, her gaze unwavering, her crown tilted toward the sun, and know that Zenobia was never alone. She was just one of the few history couldn't erase. Zenobia didn't build a grand tomb. She left behind no golden statue, no marble palace, no preserved chariot, no museum-worthy crown. And yet she's still here. Her legacy is, in a way, a paradox. Her story survives through fragments, biased, exaggerated, political. But those fragments seeded a myth that refused burial. For over 2,000 years, her name resurfaces whenever the world needs reminding that power doesn't always wear a helmet or come from the West. Zenobia has been refracted through countless lenses. To medieval Europe, she was a seductive threat. To the modern Middle East, she is a symbol of resistance, of national pride, especially in lands long cast under imperial shadows. Her statue stands in Syria. Children learn about her in textbooks. Politicians quote her when invoking resilience and independence. But beyond the icon, beyond the legend, there's something profoundly human in her story. It's the tale of a queen besieged, forced to choose between submission and defiance. A person, backed into a corner by one of history's mightiest empires, who chose to strike back and nearly won. In a world that often erases the names of warrior queens, Zenobia remains, like a blade buried beneath the sands of Palmyra, waiting for new generations hungry for stories of untamable courage. She reminds us that history is not only kings and empires, it is also mothers and queens, grief and defiance, dust and iron. It is the quiet moments after conquest, when a woman stands alone atop the silent walls of Palmyra, knowing she changed the current of an empire, but will never be fully trusted for it. And perhaps that is her greatest legacy, the refusal to be forgotten. No throne? No problem. Her name still rides the Syrian wind. Her story still makes Roman emperors look mortal. And her legend still whispers this warning: come conquer me, and you may meet your own undoing. So the next time you hear of a mighty empire's fall, remember, the final blow doesn't always come from a faraway army, but from a queen on camelback in a sandstorm, the one Roman history tried to erase, but never quite succeeded. Imagine a life where your walls are built from the cold northern winds, your roof from reindeer hide, and your front door opens to the shimmering light of melting snow. No palaces, no stone statues, no national anthems etched on bronze bells. Only the ancient chimes of reindeer bells, the aurora borealis dancing atop your tent, and the slow heartbeat of those who live with the snow. For the Sami people, eternity isn't found in stone tablets. It's found in a melody passed down through generations. From the Sahara Desert to the Central Asian steppes, other nomadic peoples have also written epics not with ink, but with smoke, fire, legend, and memory. The Berbers don't need castles. They have Kahina, the desert's general. She doesn't need a throne, just sand, a sword, and faith. When Arab armies descended, she didn't retreat. She resisted not only with spears but with identity. The Berbers weren't assimilated. They are the desert in human form. Then there are the Tuareg, the blue warriors. Men veil their faces. Women compose poetry. Amidst the storm, they don't scream. They sing. No landmarks define them, only the wind and mysterious songs. They don't build walls, but they preserve the soul of the Sahara in every indigo thread. Their tents aren't fixed, but their honor is immutable. To the east, the ancient Turks left more than bones and ashes. They carved their words into stone. The Orkhon inscriptions are the steppes' declaration. Their ancestors were wolves. They followed the wild howl and dreamed of a vast Asia, where Khans were chosen not by blood, but by intellect and fire. They didn't write history with ink. They etched it with swords and mythology. The Kazakhs hunt eagles as if capturing the sun's shadow. Each wing beat is a prayer. Each hoofbeat is an epic. In their yurts, there's no throne, but there is poetry. No dynastic records, but there are legends. And no one needs to write it down because the Kazakh memory is a boundless steppe. And finally, the Huns. They didn't come to stay, only to change. They didn't build. They moved and made the Western Empire tremble. Attila didn't need a Roman throne. He needed a horse and a gaze potent enough to make Rome pale. They were the whirlwind on horseback, the lightning across the Danube. The swords clang upon civilization, reminding the world that history isn't only written by law, it's also written by thunder. They didn't build temples. They left no maps, but they left their shadows on the steppes, deserts, and snowfields. And whenever someone sings in the night, it might be the echo of peoples who once lived, loved, died, and were reborn with the wind. Among them, the Xiongnu people are renowned for their exhilarating epic tales. In truth, most Xiongnu were illiterate, but they didn't need literacy. Their knowledge was encoded in songs, proverbs, and memory. What set the Xiongnu apart was how they turned mobility into a weapon. Under their khans, tribal boundaries were erased and reorganized into a merit-based system. Loyalty to the clan was replaced by loyalty to the khan. Then the world changed. Xiongnu warfare was a dance of speed and deception. Their mounted archers could shoot accurately while galloping, feign retreat to lure enemies, and cover over 100 miles a day. But they weren't merely raiders. They were strategists. They employed reconnaissance, espionage, signals, and psychological warfare with chilling precision. Once they began conquering fortresses, they adapted swiftly. Siege engineers from eastern and western lands were recruited. The Xiongnu learned to construct catapults, fire arrows, and siege towers, and used them with terrifying efficiency. But here's the twist. They weren't just destroyers. The Xiongnu Empire connected the world in unprecedented ways. They lived near, guarded, and sometimes controlled major trade routes from China to Central Asia. Goods, ideas, and even diseases traveled through their vast network. They promoted religious tolerance among tribes. A Buddhist merchant, a native shaman, a Taoist monk, anyone could traverse Xiongnu territory as long as they didn't incite rebellion. Yet they remained nomads at heart. Despite managing vast territories, Xiongnu leaders returned to their tents, herds, and expansive steppes. They conquered cities but never truly belonged to them, because no matter how high they rose, they always had the wind at their backs. To settled empires, nomads were both useful and dangerous, sometimes both simultaneously. But for nomads, the line between trade and plunder was negotiable. Today, they might escort your caravan across the desert. Tomorrow, they might raid your frontier. It all depended on mood, season, and your generosity. Trade was vital to nomadic life. They didn't grow grains or make pottery. They needed tools, fabrics, spices, and luxury goods. In return, they provided livestock, furs, leather, salt, and rare items like eagles or prized horses. Some traded directly with empires. Others acted as intermediaries between distant regions, creating vital links along the Silk Road and other transcontinental routes. But these weren't gentle caravans. They were armed groups ready to defend or attack as circumstances dictated. A tribal leader might negotiate with a border official this week, then raid his granary the next. Empires called it betrayal. Nomads called it flexibility. The Xiongnu, for instance, once traded grain and gold with Chinese cities. But if deceived, they would burn the city down. Nomads protected Transasian spice routes if paid. If not, the camel caravans would change course. The Xiongnu once attempted peaceful trade with the Han dynasty. But when their merchants were killed, they responded by sweeping through the region. To nomads, trade was personal and political. Not just transactions, but respect. If a settled kingdom treated them fairly, commerce flourished. If they showed contempt, punishment came on horseback. This tension created a peculiar relationship. Border economies. Towns on the edge of nomadic lands became hybrid spaces. Half garrison, half marketplace. Officials bribed chieftains. Tribes exchanged news, horses, and intelligence. Sometimes marriages were arranged to maintain fragile peace. The dance between trade and plunder wasn't a flaw in nomadic life. It was a feature. It allowed them to negotiate power without occupying land, influence empires without building cities, and remain agile in a world that revered walls. They didn't need to conquer cities, just make the cities keep watch on the horizon. In a world without libraries, scrolls, or printing presses, how do you preserve history? For nomads, the answer is simple and powerful. Remember it. Oral tradition isn't just a storytelling tool. It's living memory. Oral tradition is the library, the court, the constitution, and the myth all rolled into one. From the grasslands of the ancient Turkic peoples to the Altai Mountains, from the Kazakh steppes to the lands of the Tuareg, memory is sacred, and the tongue sharper than the sword. Elders are not just the old, they are living memory. They know genealogies stretching back dozens of generations, the wars that shaped tribal identity, and the proverbs that once determined the outcome of battles or arranged marriages. These aren't stories told around a fire just for amusement. They are lessons, warnings, and unwritten laws. For the Tuareg, poetry is royalty. A well-crafted poem can shame enemies, honor the fallen, or settle disputes without bloodshed. Poets, or imzad, are advisors to tribal leaders, remembered more than warriors. Their words can ignite wars or extinguish them, and their memory, flawless. Heroic epics are passed down intact generation after generation. The Turkic peoples are no different. The carved Orkan inscriptions are the final record of a tradition once preserved only in songs and memory. Myths of the guiding gray wolf of Bilge Khan and the dream of a grand Asian nation weren't written down. They were etched into blood. Even the Kazakhs, scattered across mountains and steppes, preserve endless epics of eagle hunters, tribal feuds, and the resolve of those who never bowed to power. When Russian scholars came to document their traditions, they were merely recording echoes of a living memory. Their history isn't etched in stone. It is breathed, remembered, and retold in the husky voice of the wind. Oral tradition has its risks. Memory can fade, stories can shift. But it has one supreme advantage. It lives. It adapts, evolves, and carries a deeply human identity. It allows nomadic peoples to preserve their essence even after migration, defeat, or assimilation. Empires may fall, archives may turn to ash, but the stories endure. Not because they were written, but because they were inscribed in breath. And as long as someone remembers, nothing is truly gone. While many ancient civilizations confined women behind veils or palace walls, in nomadic societies, the story was often the exact opposite. On the move, everyone had to work, which meant women held power. From the Turkic to the Kazakhs, archaeological and historical evidence shows that nomadic women were not just mothers and wives. They were riders, warriors, shamans, diplomats, and tribal leaders. A mobile life left no room for idle hands. Everyone, regardless of gender, had to contribute to survival, warfare, and governance. Take the Kazakhs, for example. Women rode horses to hunt eagles, wielded swords, and rode shoulder to shoulder with men. They didn't merely exist, they fought, they led. Turkic women, in ancient records, governed territories, signed treaties, and even led armies into battle. In Tuareg tribes, where women are cultural stewards, they control property, choose husbands, and own the tents. Religion also granted nomadic women spiritual power. In many ancient shamanic cultures across the Altai and Siberia, female shamans were healers, soul guides, and keepers of ancestral knowledge. They weren't eccentric outsiders, they were spiritual pillars. In short, mobility creates necessity. And necessity breeds equality, at least more equality than most sedentary empires of the time could imagine. The uncertainty of nomadic life demands flexibility. If a man falls on the battlefield, a woman will take his place. No ceremony, no permission needed. In windswept societies like the ancient Gokturks or Kazakhs, a woman could lull her baby to sleep in the yurt while drawing her bow on the front lines. For them, spirituality isn't tied to temples or sanctuaries. It weaves through mountains, rivers, the vast sky, and journeys carried by the wind. When you live in motion, the spirits travel with you. The faith of nomadic peoples is often animistic, bound to nature, the seasonal cycles, and the rhythm of survival. The wind is not just weather, it's a calling. The mountains are guardians. Streams are souls. Fire is sacred. Life is a dialogue with the invisible. In ancient Turkic tradition, deities were called Tengri, the eternal blue sky. No temple required. The sky was the temple. Every sacred oath was spoken beneath the heavens and beside the fire. Rituals could include horse offerings, sage smoke, and chants to summon ancestral spirits. There were no priests in robes, only warriors, wise women, and shamans who spoke to the sky. Among the Kazakhs, female shamans, Foxy, were keepers of knowledge, healers, interpreters of omens, and at times, counselors seated beside Khans in moments of critical decision. Among the Tuareg, the blue people of the Sahara, faith lives in poetry and oral tradition. Though largely Muslim, they still believe in ancient forces hidden in hot stones, white sands, and moonlight. Women preserve rituals and honor, where every scarf is a whispered prayer. The beauty of nomadic belief lies in its adaptability. When they encountered Islam, Christianity, or Buddhism, they didn't clash. They blended. A Khan might build a church for his son-in-law, burn incense for his aged mother, and still ride to sacrifice to the sky in spring. While cities build walls to contain their gods, nomads need only the sky above, earth below, and memory within. They didn't leave pyramids or temples behind. Their capital cities have no names on maps, yet their legacy is etched into history through trade routes, the scars of war, and even the languages we speak today. The Gokturks, Tuareg, ancient Kazakhs, they are not footnotes in history books. They are the changing winds, the ruptures that renew. The Silk Road didn't just carry silk. It was a highway of hooves, tribal diplomacy, and migratory memory. Without them, East and West might never have touched. Empires feared them, and rightly so. From the Huns to the Mongols, from the Gokturks to the Ottomans, they shattered the myth that civilization can only grow from cities. Their victories revealed a truth. Mobility can outmatch monuments. While cities needed walls, they needed wind. While metropolises depended on storage, they survived on instinct. But their impact was not just military. They were cultural bridges, bringing music, cuisine, legends, and belief systems from one land to another. Turkic rule carried the Orkhan script to the edge of China. Tuareg poetry influenced Sufi verse. Kazakhs passed down epic tales through the komus and generational storytelling. They no longer forge empires, but their spirit lives on. You see it in horseback skills, in the art of storytelling, in the values of connection, resilience, and freedom, still echoing from steppe to desert, from Arctic dusk to Central Asian dawn. They remind us that no dynasty is eternal, not even the grandest castles of the north. The Sami, living among eternal snow, prove that the northern wind can melt even the most immovable borders. And true power needs no throne or palace, just a sacred drum and a story told by firelight. Today, many Sami communities still exist, though divided by national borders, threatened by climate change and modernization. Yet, in reindeer fur cloaks and the trembling notes of the joik, their descendants preserve traditions older than the oldest constitutions. Reverence for the land and sky, bonds with the reindeer, and songs that whisper through centuries like voices riding the snow-laden wind. So when you read history, don't just look at victories, maps, or stone tombs. Listen between the silences. That's where the Sami live, and that's where the soul of history still lingers. At the dawn of the 20th century, the narrow strip of land known as Panama was not just a swath of tropical jungle. It was the crossroads of grand dreams and deadly nightmares. When the Americans took over the canal project from the French in 1904, they inherited more than rusting machinery and unfinished plans. They inherited a graveyard of over 22,000 workers who had fallen to yellow fever and malaria. But the dream endured. A waterway connecting two oceans. A canal cutting across the continent, saving thousands of miles of sea travel. Unthinkable to some, inevitable to others. Visionaries believed it could reshape global trade, enhance naval power, and assert America's presence on the world stage. Yet ambition alone wasn't enough. It required money, labor, technology, and a war against nature itself. That's when Colonel William C. Gorgas arrived, armed with a bold plan to kill the mosquitoes. He launched sweeping sanitation campaigns, spraying insecticides, installing mosquito nets, improving drainage systems, and ensuring clean water supplies. On paper, it was an engineering marvel. In reality, it became one of the most grueling construction efforts in human history. Workers had to excavate millions of cubic meters of earth, facing landslides, floods, and the suffocating heat of the tropics. Thousands of immigrants from the Caribbean, Europe, and Asia were brought in to do the work. The reward would be great, but so would the human cost. And for the indigenous communities whose land the canal would slice like a scar, this wasn't progress, it was a warning. Within a decade, more than 5,000 workers had died from disease and workplace accidents. Yet the digging continued. When the French began the project in 1881, they quickly realized that the map didn't capture the true challenges. Panama's jungle was not only dense but infested with mosquitoes carrying deadly yellow fever and malaria. In just 9 years, around 20,000 workers died, mostly from disease and brutal working conditions. In 1904, the Americans took over and faced the same horrors. Dr. William Gorgas responded with a vast public health campaign. Mosquito eradication, improved drainage, and clean water. His efforts drastically lowered death rates, paving the way for construction to continue. One of the greatest challenges was cutting through the Culebra mountain range. Workers used dynamite and steam shovels to break through solid rock. But constant landslides caused numerous accidents and delays. Hundreds of trainloads of debris had to be moved daily. Still, the work progressed meter by meter. The workforce came largely from Caribbean islands, especially Barbados and Martinique. They toiled under harsh conditions, for meager pay, and lived in makeshift camps. Racial segregation and deplorable living conditions meant death rates among these workers were far higher than among white laborers. There were also workers from China, Europe, and other countries. They made invaluable contributions to the project, though their names and stories are rarely acknowledged in the history books. While American engineers tackled technical challenges, non-white workers endured severe discrimination. They were paid less, lived in worse conditions, and received minimal medical care. Yet they were the backbone of the workforce, over 80%, and it was they who carved the canal between two oceans. They dug through jungle, endured disease, and braved the wrath of nature.
No fireworks.
No instant glory, just the sound of shovels amid the buzz of mosquitoes and the smell of damp earth. This was where imperial dreams were dug by the hands of the nameless. They left no monuments or tombstones, but their imprint remains in the waters that flow through the Panama Canal. The canal is often remembered as a triumph of engineering, a link between the Pacific and Atlantic. But behind the map lies blood. Behind every meter of water, a body. The men hired from the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, are absent from textbooks but present in every graveyard. They worked in unimaginable conditions. Blistering heat, mosquito-infested jungles riddled with yellow fever, malaria, and venomous snakes. Every rain turned pits into muddy traps. Landslides were routine, and death was just an operating cost. As for wages, black workers received a third of what white workers earned. For the same mud, the same bricks, the same blood, black workers were placed on the silver roll. With the worst conditions, shabby housing, and virtually no rights, white workers, mostly Americans, were on the gold roll. With clean homes, private hospitals, even country clubs. The canal didn't just divide oceans, it divided human dignity. And don't forget, while engineers were photographed and immortalized on bronze plaques, tens of thousands of workers, those who hauled stone, dug trenches, battled disease, and died in silence, left nothing behind but a mass grave labeled the Nameless, a memorial with no faces. When the canal was completed in 1914, the world rejoiced. But in the celebration photos, we see only white hats and tailored suits. No coarse shirts, no sun-darkened Caribbean skin. History took the photo but cropped the frame. And the laborers, they were left out of the final picture. American flags fluttered against the tropical sky of the canal zone. Ship horns blared in celebration. U.S. newspapers sang in unison. The seas have been split, the oceans united. On August 15, 1914, the cargo ship SS Ancon officially passed through the Panama Canal, marking the moment America proved to the world it could command nature and shape the fate of oceans. This was a golden moment in history, when two coastlines were joined by a massive incision through jungle and mountain rock. The journey from New York to San Francisco, once taking weeks via the dangerous Cape Horn, was now shortened to just days. It was as if the world of commerce had been stitched together with a thread of steel and concrete. This was American engineering, the spirit of conquest, cast into an 80-kilometer-long waterway through the heart of a continent. But not everyone was in that historic frame. Nowhere to be seen were the tens of thousands of West Indian laborers, Jamaicans, Barbadians, Trinidadians, who had dug the canal, sweated, and perished in the sweltering heat and toxic air of a land teeming with locusts and malaria. No statues were raised in their honor. No names were spoken in the victory speeches. While white American engineers were etched into history, the Silver Roll workers, black laborers segregated in pay, housing, and healthcare, were buried in nameless cemeteries. Just during the French era, 22,000 died. When the Americans took over, thousands more followed. not by bayonets but by mosquitoes, mudslides, and neglect. The Panama Canal is not only a feat of engineering, it is a scar on the map and a rupture in conscience. It allows ships to cross oceans, but it also severed the lives and dignity of those deemed cheap labor. They had no seats on the podium, but they laid the foundation for the dream of global shipping. The canal ignited global economics. Cargo ships, trade, soldiers, and power now flowed through the U.S. as a new center. It made America a strategic pivot and extended arm of empire. But it also turned indigenous lands and Afro-Caribbean communities into a silenced backstage. With every meter of canal dug, the sovereignty and dignity of thousands were carved deeper. The impact wasn't gradual, it was brutal and absolute. Thousands of workers from the West Indies, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad were thrown into the tropical jungle like nameless nails. Scorching heat, filthy water, venomous mosquitoes, and landslides killed many before the first ship even passed through. At one point, hundreds were dying each week. They say the canal is a symbol of modern ingenuity, but most of it was dug with iron picks, dull shovels, and bare hands. Their deaths went unrecorded. No plaques, no statues, while American engineers and French technocrats were celebrated. Those who truly endured were erased from the picture. The canal didn't just open a transcontinental trade route, it carried empire with it. It brought the U.S. military into the Caribbean and made Panama a strategic backyard. It gave the U.S. a new geopolitical power while pushing native residents to the margins. Beneath the concrete and modern locks was a meticulously engineered racial hierarchy. The gold roll for whites with high pay, clean homes, private hospitals. The silver roll for blacks, squalid, dangerous, and voiceless. Around the canal, segregated compounds sprang up, not merely to house but to divide. Divide classes, divide races, divide dignity. The laborers weren't just tools. They became disposable, forgettable, and justified through payrolls and the rhetoric of progress. The Panama Canal shortened sea voyages, but lengthened colonial wounds. It is a marvel, no doubt, but it is also a stain unwashable. It didn't just split a continent, it split memory. In textbooks, the canal is a symbol of triumph. But in truth, it is a sunken coffin, where tens of thousands of Caribbean dreams were buried before they could take flight. When the SS Ancon became the first official ship to pass through the canal in 1914, it marked not just the start of a new shipping route. It marked the dawn of an era where power was measured in engine capacity and human worth in skin color. The change was real, trade exploded, global transport was transformed forever. But the price of opening a path for ships was not just Earth, it was lives. The Panama Canal made the world smaller, but it also made inequality deeper, more persistent, and quieter. It opened doors for merchants, engineers, politicians, but closed them for poor workers to be remembered. It is a structure of glory, but also of tragedy. A project that did not just dig into land, but into the memory of humankind. And once that first ship crossed those reverse current waters, history was never whole again. The Panama Canal did not just divide two oceans. It split two realities. One of those who made history, and one of those buried by it. The greatness of the Panama Canal is undeniable, but the silence of those who sacrificed must not be forgotten. The victory photo of that day didn't capture the full truth, because the most remarkable thing wasn't the first ship, nor the medal awarded, but the bare hands, the unnamed souls who bent the water and history to their will with their lives. The Panama Canal is a grand route, but behind its success are tens of thousands of lost lives, untold stories, and silent sacrifices. It proves humanity can conquer nature, but the price at times is far too high. So when you look at the Panama Canal, don't just see ships gliding through. Remember the hands that dug it, the sweat and blood spilled, and the spirits that still linger here.